Anyone living in the United States in the early 1990s and paying even a whisper of attention to the nightly news or a daily paper could be forgiven for having been scared out of his skin. The culprit was crime. It had been rising relentlessly. A graph plotting the crime rate in any American city over recent decades looked like a ski slope in prowler, and it seemed now to herald the end of the world as we knew it. Death by gunnery, intentional and otherwise, had become commonplace. So too had carjacking and crack dealing, robbery and rape. Violent crime was a gruesome, constant companion. And things were about to get even worse. Much worse. All the experts were saying so. The cause was the so-called superpredator. For a time, he was everywhere. Glowering from the cover of newsweeklies. Swaggering his way through foot-thick government reports. He was a scrawny, big-city teenager with a cheap gun in his hand and nothing in his heart but ruthlessness. There were thousands out there just like him, we were told, a generation of killers about to hurl the country into deepest chaos. In 1995, the criminologist James Allen Fox wrote a report for the U.S. Attorney General that grimly detailed the coming spike in murders by teenagers. Fox proposed optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. In the optimistic scenario, he believed the rate of teen homicides would rise another 15% over the next decade. In the pessimistic scenario, it would more than double. The next crime wave will get so bad, he said, that it will make 1995 look like the good old days. Other criminologists, political scientists, and similarly learned forecasters laid out the same horrible future, as did President Clinton. We know we've got about 6 years to turn this juvenile crime thing around, Clinton said, or our country is going to be living with chaos. And my successors will not be giving speeches about the wonderful opportunities of the global economy, they'll be trying to keep body and soul together for people on the streets of these cities. The smart money was plainly on the criminals. And then, instead of going up and up and up, crime began to fall. And fall and fall and fall some more. The crime drop was startling in several respects. It was ubiquitous, with every category of crime falling in every part of the country. It was persistent, with incremental decreases year after year. And it was entirely unanticipated, especially by the very experts who had been predicting the opposite. The magnitude of the reversal was astounding. The teenage murder rate, instead of rising 100% or even 15% as James Allen Fox had warned, fell more than 50% within VE years. By 2000, the overall murder rate in the United States had dropped to its lowest level in 30 VE years. So had the rate of just about every other sort of crime, from assault to car theft. Even though the experts had failed to anticipate the crime drop, which was in fact well underway even as they made their horrifying predictions, they now hurried to explain it. Most of their theories sounded perfectly logical. It was the roaring 1990s economy, they said, that helped turn back crime. It was the proliferation of gun control laws, they said. It was the sort of innovative policing strategies put into place in New York City, where murders would fall from 2,262 in 1990 to 540 in 2005. These theories were not only logical, they were also encouraging, for they attributed the crime drop to specie and recent human initiatives. If it was gun control and clever police strategies and better-paying jobs that quelled crime, well then, the power to stop criminals had been within our reach all along. As it would be the next time, God forbid, that crime got so bad. These theories made their way, seemingly without friction, from the experts' mouths to journalists' ears to the public's mind. In short course, they became conventional wisdom. There was only one problem: they weren't true. There was another factor, meanwhile, that had greatly contributed to the massive crime drop of the 1990s. It had taken shape more than 20 years earlier and concerned a young woman in Dallas named Norma McCorvey. Like the proverbial butter wire that apps its wings on one continent and eventually causes a hurricane on another, Norma McCorvey dramatically altered the course of events without intending to. All she had wanted was an abortion. She was a poor, uneducated, unskilled, alcoholic, drug-using 21-year-old woman who had already given up 2 children for adoption and now, in 1970, found herself pregnant again. But in Texas, as in all but a few states at that time, abortion was illegal. McCorvey's cause came to be adopted by people far more powerful than she. They made her the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit seeking to legalize abortion. The defendant was Henry Wade, the Dallas County District Attorney. The case ultimately made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, by which time McCorvey's name had been disguised as Jane Roe. On January 22, 1973, the court ruled in favor of Ms. Roe, allowing legalized abortion throughout the United States. By this time, of course, it was far too late for Ms. McCorvey Roe to have her abortion. She had given birth and put the child up for adoption. Years later she would renounce her allegiance to legalized abortion and become a pro-life activist. So how did Roe v. Wade help trigger, a generation later, the greatest crime drop in recorded history? As far as crime is concerned, it turns out that not all children are born equal. Not even close. Decades of studies have shown that a child born into an adverse family environment is far more likely than other children to become a criminal. And the millions of women most likely to have an abortion in the wake of Roe v. Wade, poor, unmarried, and teenage mothers for whom illegal abortions had been too expensive or too hard to get, were often models of adversity. They were the very women whose children, if born, would have been much more likely than average to become criminals. But because of Roe v. Wade, these children weren't being born. This powerful cause would have a drastic, distant effect. Years later, just as these unborn children would have entered their criminal primes, the rate of crime began to plummet. It wasn't gun control or a strong economy or new police strategies that narrowly blunted the American crime wave. It was, among other factors, the reality that the pool of potential criminals had dramatically shrunk. Now, as the crime drop experts, the former crime doomsayers, spun their theories to the media, how many times did they cite legalized abortion as a cause? 0. It is the quintessential blend of commerce and camaraderie. You hire a real estate agent to sell your home. She sizes up its charms, snaps some pictures, sets the price, writes a seductive ad, shows the house aggressively, negotiates the offers, and sees the deal through to its end. Sure, it's a lot of work, but she's getting a nice cut. On the sale of a $300,000 house, a typical 6% agent fee yields $18,000. $18,000, you say to yourself, that's a lot of money. But you also tell yourself that you never could have sold the house for $300,000 on your own. The agent knew how to, what's that phrase she used, maximize the house's value. She got you top dollar, right? Right. A real estate agent is a different breed of expert than a criminologist, but she is every bit the expert. That is, she knows her eld far better than the layman on whose behalf she is acting. She is better informed about the house's value, the state of the housing market, even the buyer's frame of mind. You depend on her for this information. That, in fact, is why you hired an expert. As the world has grown more specialized, countless such experts have made themselves similarly indispensable. Doctors, lawyers, contractors, stockbrokers, auto mechanics, mortgage brokers, financial planners, they all enjoy a gigantic informational advantage. And they use that advantage to help you, the person who hired them, get exactly what you want for the best price. Right? It would be lovely to think so. But experts are human, and humans respond to incentives. How any given expert treats you, therefore, will depend on how that expert's incentives are set up. Sometimes his incentives may work in your favor. For instance, a study of California auto mechanics found they often passed up a small repair bill by letting failing cars pass emissions inspections, the reason being that lenient mechanics are rewarded with repeat business. But in a different case, an expert's incentives may work against you. In a medical study, it turned out that obstetricians in areas with declining birth rates are much more likely to perform caesarean section deliveries than obstetricians in growing areas, suggesting that when business is tough, doctors try to ring up more expensive procedures. It is one thing to muse about experts abusing their position and another to prove it. The best way to do so would be to measure how an expert treats you versus how he performs the same service for himself. Unfortunately, a surgeon doesn't operate on himself. Nor is his medical law a matter of public record, neither is an auto mechanic's repair log for his own car. Real estate sales, however, are a matter of public record. And real estate agents often do sell their own homes. A recent set of data covering the sale of nearly 100,000 houses in suburban Chicago shows that more than 3,000 of those houses were owned by the agents themselves. Before plunging into the data, it helps to ask a question: what is the real estate agent's incentive when she is selling her own home? Simple: to make the best deal possible. Presumably this is also your incentive when you are selling your home. And so your incentive and the real estate agent's incentive would seem to be nicely aligned. Her commission, after all, is based on the sale price. But as incentives go, commissions are tricky. First of all, a 6% real estate commission is typically split between the seller's agent and the buyer's. Each agent then kicks back roughly half of her take to the agency. Which means that only 1.5% of the purchase price goes directly into your agent's pocket. So on the sale of your $300,000 house, her personal take of the $18,000 commission is $4,500. Still not bad, you say. But what if the house was actually worth more than $300,000? What if, with a little more effort and patience and a few more newspaper ads, she could have sold it for $310,000? After the commission, that puts an additional $9,400 in your pocket. But the agent's additional share, her personal 1.5% of the extra $10,000, is a mere $150. If you earn $9,400 while she earns only $150, maybe your incentives aren't aligned after all. Especially when she's the one paying for the ads and doing all the work. Is the agent willing to put out all that extra time, money, and energy for just $150? There's one way to ND out, measure the difference between the sales data for houses that belong to real estate agents themselves and the houses they sold on behalf of clients. Using the data from the sales of those 100,000 Chicago homes, and controlling for any number of variables, location, age and quality of the house, aesthetics, whether or not the property was an investment, and so on, it turns out that a real estate agent keeps her own home on the market an average of 10 days longer and sells it for an extra 3+%, or $10,000 on a $300,000 house. When she sells her own house, an agent holds out for the best offer. When she sells yours, she encourages you to take the RST decent offer that comes along. Like a stockbroker churning commissions, she wants to make deals and make them fast. Why not? Her share of a better offer, $150, is too puny an incentive to encourage her to do otherwise. Of all the truisms about politics, one is held to be truer than the rest: money buys elections. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Michael Bloomberg, John Corzine, these are but a few recent, dramatic examples of the truism at work. Disregard for a moment the contrary examples of Steve Forbes, Michael Huff NGTON, and especially Thomas Golisano, who over the course of 3 gubernatorial elections in New York spent $93 million of his own money and won 4%, 8%, and 14%, respectively, of the vote. Most people would agree that money has an undue influence on elections and that far too much money is spent on political campaigns. Indeed, election data show it is true that the candidate who spends more money in a campaign usually wins. But is money the cause of the victory? It might seem logical to think so, much as it might have seemed logical that a booming 1990s economy helped reduce crime. But just because two things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. A correlation simply means that a relationship exists between two factors, let's call them X and Y, but it tells you nothing about the direction of that relationship. It's possible that X causes Y, it's also possible that Y causes X, and it may be that X and Y are both being caused by some other factor. Z. Think about this correlation. Cities with a lot of murders also tend to have a lot of police of CERS. Consider now the police-murder correlation in a pair of real cities. Denver and Washington, D.C., have about the same population, but Washington has nearly 3 times as many police as Denver, and it also has 8 times the number of murders. Unless you have more information, however, it's hard to say what's causing what. Someone who didn't know better might contemplate these gores and conclude that it is all those extra police in Washington who are causing the extra murders. Such wayward thinking, which has a long history, generally provokes a wayward response. Consider the folktale of the Tsar who learned that the most disease-ridden province in his empire was also the province with the most doctors. His solution? He promptly ordered all the doctors shot dead. Now, returning to the issue of campaign spending, in order to gure out the relationship between money and elections, it helps to consider the incentives at play in campaign finance. Let's say you are the kind of person who might contribute $1,000 to a candidate. Chances are you'll give the money in one of 2 situations: a close race, in which you think the money will influence the outcome, or a campaign in which one candidate is a sure winner and you would like to bask in re-elected glory or receive some future in-kind consideration. The one candidate you won't contribute to is a sure loser. Just ask any presidential hopeful who bombs in Iowa and New Hampshire. So front-runners and incumbents raise a lot more money than long shots. And what about spending that money? Incumbents and frontrunners obviously have more cash, but they only spend a lot of it when they stand a legitimate chance of losing. Otherwise, why dip into a war chest that might be more useful later on, when a more formidable opponent appears? Now picture 2 candidates, one intrinsically appealing and the other not so. The appealing candidate raises much more money and wins easily. But was it the money that won him the votes, or was it his appeal that won the votes and the money? That's a crucial question, but a very hard one to answer. Voter appeal, after all, isn't easy to quantify. How can it be measured? It can't, really, except in one special case. The key is to measure a candidate against himself. That is, candidate A today is likely to be similar to candidate A 2 or 4 years hence. The same could be said for candidate B if only candidate A ran against candidate B in 2 consecutive elections but in each case spent different amounts of money. Then, with the candidate's appeal more or less constant, we could measure the money's impact. As it turns out, the same 2 candidates run against each other in consecutive elections all the time, indeed, in nearly 1,000 U.S. congressional races since 1972. What do the numbers have to say about such cases? Here's the surprise: the amount of money spent by the candidates hardly matters at all. A winning candidate can cut his spending in half and lose only 1% of the vote. Meanwhile, a losing candidate who doubles his spending can expect to shift the vote in his favor by only that same 1%. What really matters for a political candidate is not how much you spend, what matters is who you are. The same could be said, and will be said, in Chapter 5, about parents. Some politicians are inherently attractive to voters and others simply aren't, and no amount of money can do much about it. Messrs. Forbes, Huff Ngton, and Golisano already know this, of course. And what about the other half of the election truism, that the amount of money spent on campaign finance is obscenely huge? In a typical election period that includes campaigns for the presidency, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, about $1 billion is spent per year, which sounds like a lot of money, unless you care to measure it against something seemingly less important than democratic elections. It is the same amount, for instance, that Americans spend every year on chewing gum. This isn't a book about the cost of chewing gum versus campaign spending per se, or about disingenuous real estate agents, or the impact of legalized abortion on crime. It will certainly address these scenarios and dozens more, from the art of parenting to the mechanics of cheating, from the inner workings of a crack-selling gang to racial discrimination on the weakest link. What this book is about is stripping a layer or two from the surface of modern life and seeing what is happening underneath. We will ask a lot of questions, some frivolous and some about life and death issues. The answers may often seem odd but, after the fact, also rather obvious. We will seek out these answers in the data, whether those data come in the form of schoolchildren's test scores or New York City's crime statistics or a crack dealer's financial records. Often we will take advantage of patterns in the data that were incidentally left behind, like an airplane's sharp contrail in a high sky. It is well and good to opine or theorize about a subject, as humankind is wont to do, but when moral posturing is replaced by an honest assessment of the data, the result is often a new, surprising insight. Morality, it could be argued, represents the way that people would like the world to work, whereas economics represents how it actually does work. Economics is above all a science of measurement. It comprises an extraordinarily powerful and equable set of tools that can reliably assess a thicket of information to determine the effect of any one factor, or even the whole effect. That's what the economy is, after all, a thicket of information about jobs and real estate and banking and investment. But the tools of economics can be just as easily applied to subjects that are more interesting. This book, then, has been written from a very specie worldview, based on a few fundamental ideas. Incentives are the cornerstone of modern life. And understanding them, or, often, ferreting them out, is the key to solving just about any riddle, from violent crime to sports cheating to online dating. The conventional wisdom is often wrong. Crime didn't keep soaring in the 1990s, money alone doesn't win elections, and, surprise, drinking 8 glasses of water a day has never actually been shown to do a thing for your health. Conventional wisdom is often shoddily formed and devilishly difficult to see through, but it can be done. Dramatic effects often have distant, even subtle, causes. The answer to a given riddle is not always right in front of you. Norma McCorvey had a far greater impact on crime than did the combined forces of gun control, a strong economy, and innovative police strategies. So did, as we shall see, a man named Oscar Danilo Blandon, aka the Johnny Appleseed of crack. Experts, from criminologists to real estate agents, use their informational advantage to serve their own agenda. However, they can be beat at their own game. And in the face of the Internet, their informational advantage is shrinking every day, as evidenced by, among other things, the falling price of COFNS and life insurance premiums. Knowing what to measure and how to measure it makes a complicated world much less so. If you learn to look at data in the right way, you can explain riddles that otherwise might have seemed impossible. Because there is nothing like the sheer power of numbers to scrub away layers of confusion and contradiction. So the aim of this book is to explore the hidden side of everything. This may occasionally be a frustrating exercise. It may sometimes feel as if we are peering at the world through a straw or even staring into a funhouse mirror, but the idea is to look at many different scenarios and examine them in a way they have rarely been examined. In some regards, this is a strange concept for a book. Most books put forth a single theme, crisply expressed in a sentence or two, and then tell the entire story of that theme, the history of salt, the fragility of democracy, the use and misuse of punctuation. This book has no such unifying theme. We did consider, for about 6 minutes, writing a book that would revolve around a single theme, the theory and practice of applied microeconomics, but opted instead for a sort of treasure hunt approach. Yes, this approach employs the best analytical tools that economics can offer, but it also allows us to follow whatever freakish curiosities may occur to us. Thus our invented eld of study, freakonomics. The sort of stories told in this book are not often covered in Econ 101, but that may change. Since the science of economics is primarily a set of tools, as opposed to a subject matter, then no subject, however offbeat, need be beyond its reach. It is worth remembering that Adam Smith, the founder of classical economics, was first and foremost a philosopher. He strove to be a moralist and, in doing so, became an economist. When he published The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, modern capitalism was just getting underway. Smith was entranced by the sweeping changes wrought by this new force, but it wasn't just the numbers that interested him. It was the human effect, the fact that economic forces were vastly changing the way a person thought and behaved in a given situation. What might lead one person to cheat or steal while another didn't? How would one person's seemingly innocuous choice, good or bad, affect a great number of people down the line? In Smith's era, cause and effect had begun to wildly accelerate, incentives were magni ed tenfold. The gravity and shock of these changes were as overwhelming to the citizens of his time as the gravity and shock of modern life may seem to us today. Smith's true subject was the friction between individual desire and societal norms. The economic historian Robert Heilbronner, writing in The Worldly Philosophers, wondered how Smith was able to separate the doings of man, a creature of self-interest, from the greater moral plane in which man operated. Smith held that the answer lay in our ability to put ourselves in the position of a third person, an impartial observer, Heilbronner wrote, and in this way to form a notion of the objective merits of a case. Consider yourself, then, in the company of a third person, or, if you will, a pair of third people, eager to explore the objective merits of interesting cases. These explorations generally begin with the asking of a simple unasked question. Such as, what do schoolteachers and sumo wrestlers have in common? What do schoolteachers and sumo wrestlers have in common? Imagine for a moment that you are the manager of a daycare center. You have a clearly stated policy that children are supposed to be picked up by 4 p.m. but very often parents are late. The result, at day's end, you have some anxious children and at least one teacher who must wait around for the parents to arrive. What to do? A pair of economists who heard of this dilemma, it turned out to be a rather common one, offered a solution: the tardy parents. Why, after all, should the daycare center take care of these kids for free? The economists decided to test their solution by conducting a study of 10 daycare centers in Haifa, Israel. The study lasted 20 weeks, but the NE was not introduced immediately. For the rest 4 weeks, the economists simply kept track of the number of parents who came late. There were, on average, 8 late pickups per week per day care center. In the FTH week, the NE was enacted. It was announced that any parent arriving more than 10 minutes late would pay $3 per child for each incident. The fee would be added to the parent's monthly bill, which was roughly $380. After the NE was enacted, the number of late pickups promptly went up. Before long there were 20 late pickups per week, more than double the original average. The incentive had plainly back-read. Economics is, at root, the study of incentives, how people get what they want, or need, especially when other people want or need the same thing. Economists love incentives. They love to dream them up and enact them, study them and tinker with them. The typical economist believes the world has not yet invented a problem that he cannot X if given a free hand to design the proper incentive scheme. His solution may not always be pretty, it may involve coercion or exorbitant penalties or the violation of civil liberties, but the original problem, rest assured, will be XED. An incentive is a bullet, a lever, a key, an often tiny object with astonishing power to change a situation. We all learn to respond to incentives, negative and positive, from the outset of life. If you toddle over to the hot stove and touch it, you burn anger. But if you bring home straight A's from school, you get a new bike. If you are spotted picking your nose in class, you get ridiculed. But if you make the basketball team, you move up the social ladder. If you break curfew, you get grounded. But if you ace your SATs, you get to go to a good college. If you UNK out of law school, you have to go to work at your father's insurance company. But if you perform so well that a rival company comes calling, you become a vice president and no longer have to work for your father. If you become so excited about your new vice president job that you drive home at 80 mph, you get pulled over by the police and NED 100. But if you hit your sales projections and collect a year-end bonus, you not only aren't worried about the 100 ticket but can also afford to buy that Viking range you've always wanted, and on which your toddler can now burn her own NGER. An incentive is simply a means of urging people to do more of a good thing and less of a bad thing. But most incentives don't come about organically. Someone, an economist or a politician or a parent, has to invent them. Your 3-year-old eats all her vegetables for a week. She wins a trip to the toy store. A big steelmaker belches too much smoke into the air. The company is ned for each cubic foot of pollutants over the legal limit. Too many Americans aren't paying their share of income tax. It was the economist Milton Friedman who helped come up with a solution to this one: automatic tax withholding from employees' paychecks. There are 3 basic AVAs of incentive: economic, social, and moral. Very often a single incentive scheme will include all 3 varieties. Think about the anti-smoking campaign of recent years. The addition of a 3 per pack sin tax is a strong economic incentive against buying cigarettes. The banning of cigarettes in restaurants and bars is a powerful social incentive. And when the US government asserts that terrorists raise money by selling black market cigarettes, that acts as a rather jarring moral incentive. Some of the most compelling incentives yet invented have been put in place to deter crime. Considering this fact, it might be worthwhile to take a familiar question: why is there so much crime in modern society, and stand it on its head: why isn't there a lot more crime? After all, every one of us regularly passes up opportunities to maim, steal, and defraud. The chance of going to jail, thereby losing your job, your house, and your freedom, all of which are essentially economic penalties, is certainly a strong incentive. But when it comes to crime, people also respond to moral incentives: they don't want to do something they consider wrong, and social incentives: they don't want to be seen by others as doing something wrong. For certain types of misbehavior, social incentives are terribly powerful. In an echo of Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter, many American cities now GHT prostitution with a shaming offensive, posting pictures of convicted Johns and prostitutes on websites or on local access television. Which is a more horrifying deterrent, a 500 NE for soliciting a prostitute, or the thought of your friends and family ogling you on www.hookersandjohns.com? So through a complicated, haphazard, and constantly readjusted web of economic, social, and moral incentives, modern society does its best to militate against crime. Some people would argue that we don't do a very good job. But taking the long view, that is clearly not true. Consider the historical trend in homicide, not including wars, which is both the most reliably measured crime and the best barometer of a society's overall crime rate. These statistics, compiled by the criminologist Manuel Eisner, track the historical homicide levels in VE European regions. The steep decline of these numbers over the centuries suggests that, for one of the gravest human concerns, getting murdered, the incentives that we collectively cook up are working better and better. So what was wrong with the incentive at the Israeli daycare centers? You have probably already guessed that the 3NE was simply too small. For that price, a parent with 1 child could afford to be late every day and only pay an extra $60 each month, just 1/6 of the base fee. As babysitting goes, that's pretty cheap. What if the NE had been set at 100 instead of 3? That would have likely put an end to the late pickups, though it would have also engendered plenty of ill will. Any incentive is inherently a trade-off, the trick is to balance the extremes. But there was another problem with the daycare center NE. It substituted an economic incentive, the 3 penalty, for a moral incentive, the guilt that parents were supposed to feel when they came late. For just a few dollars each day, parents could buy off their guilt. Furthermore, the small size of the NE sent a signal to the parents that late pickups weren't such a big problem. If the daycare center suffers only 3 worth of pain for each late pickup, why bother to cut short your tennis game? Indeed, when the economists eliminated the 3NE in the 17th week of their study, the number of late-arriving parents didn't change. Now they could arrive late, pay no NE, and feel no guilt. Such is the strange and powerful nature of incentives. A slight tweak can produce drastic and often unforeseen results. Thomas Jefferson noted this while reacting on the tiny incentive that led to the Boston Tea Party and, in turn, the American Revolution. So inscrutable is the arrangement of causes and consequences in this world that a two-penny duty on tea, unjustly imposed in a sequestered part of it, changes the condition of all its inhabitants. In the 1970s, researchers conducted a study that, like the Israeli daycare study, pitted a moral incentive against an economic incentive. In this case, they wanted to learn about the motivation behind blood donations. Their discovery: when people are given a small stipend for donating blood rather than simply being praised for their altruism, they tend to donate less blood. The stipend turned a noble act of charity into a painful way to make a few dollars, and it wasn't worth it. What if the blood donors had been offered an incentive of 50, or 500, or 5,000? Surely the number of donors would have changed dramatically. But something else would have changed dramatically as well, for every incentive has its dark side. If a pint of blood were suddenly worth 5,000, you can be sure that plenty of people would take note. They might literally steal blood at knife point. They might pass off pig blood as their own. They might circumvent donation limits by using fake IDs. Whatever the incentive, whatever the situation, dishonest people will try to gain an advantage by whatever means necessary. Or, as W.C. Fields once said, a thing worth having is a thing worth cheating for. Who cheats? Well, just about anyone, if the stakes are right. You might say to yourself, I don't cheat, regardless of the stakes. And then you might remember the time you cheated on, say, a board game last week, or the golf ball you nudged out of its bad lie, or the time you really wanted a bagel in the FCE break room but couldn't come up with the dollar you were supposed to drop in the coffee can, and then took the bagel anyway, and told yourself you'd pay double the next time, and didn't. For every clever person who goes to the trouble of creating an incentive scheme, there is an army of people, clever and otherwise, who will inevitably spend even more time trying to beat it. Cheating may or may not be human nature, but it is certainly a prominent feature in just about every human endeavor. Cheating is a primordial economic act, getting more for less. So it isn't just the boldface names, inside trading CEOs and pill-popping ballplayers and perk-abusing politicians, who cheat. It is the waitress who pockets her tips instead of pooling them. It is the Walmart payroll manager who goes into the computer and shaves his employees' hours to make his own performance look better. It is the third grader who, worried about not making it to the fourth grade, copies test answers from the kid sitting next to him. Some cheating leaves barely a shadow of evidence. In other cases, the evidence is massive. Consider what happened one spring evening at midnight in 1987, 7 million American children suddenly disappeared. The worst kidnapping wave in history? Hardly. It was the night of April 15th, and the Internal Revenue Service had just changed a rule. Instead of merely listing the name of each dependent child, tax lawyers were now required to provide a social security number. Suddenly, 7 million children who had existed only as phantom exemptions on the previous year's 1040 forms, vanished, representing about 1 in 10 of all dependent children in the United States. The incentive for those cheating taxpayers was quite clear. The same for the waitress, the payroll manager, and the third grader. But what about that third grader's teacher? Might she have an incentive to cheat? And if so, how would she do it? Imagine now that instead of running a daycare center in Haifa, you are running the Chicago Public Schools, a system that educates 400,000 students each year. The most volatile current debate among American school administrators, teachers, parents, and students concerns high-stakes testing. The stakes are considered high because instead of simply testing students to measure their progress, schools are increasingly held accountable for the results. The federal government mandated high-stakes testing as part of the No Child Left Behind law, signed by President Bush in 2002. But even before that law, most states gave annual standardized tests to students in elementary and secondary school. 20 states rewarded individual schools for good test scores or dramatic improvement. 32 states sanctioned the schools that didn't do well. The Chicago public school system embraced high-stakes testing in 1996. Under the new policy, a school with low reading scores would be placed on probation and face the threat of being shut down, its staff to be dismissed or reassigned. The CPS also did away with what is known as social promotion. In the past, only a dramatically inept or DIF cult student was held back a grade. Now, in order to be promoted, every student in 3rd, 6th, and 8th grade had to manage a minimum score on the standardized, multiple-choice exam known as the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. Advocates of high-stakes testing argue that it raises the standards of learning and gives students more incentive to study. Also, if the test prevents poor students from advancing without merit, they won't clog up the higher grades and slow down good students. Opponents, meanwhile, worry that certain students will be unfairly penalized if they don't happen to test well, and that teachers may concentrate on the test topics at the exclusion of more important lessons. Schoolchildren, of course, have had incentive to cheat for as long as there have been tests. But high-stakes testing has so radically changed the incentives for teachers that they too now have added reason to cheat. With high-stakes testing, a teacher whose students test poorly can be censured or passed over for a raise or promotion. If the entire school does poorly, federal funding can be withheld. If the school is put on probation, the teacher stands to be read. High-stakes testing also presents teachers with some positive incentives. If her students do well enough, she might end herself praised, promoted, and even richer. The state of California at one point introduced bonuses of $25,000 for teachers who produced big test score gains. And if a teacher were to survey this newly incentivized landscape and consider somehow enacting her students' scores, she just might be persuaded by one null incentive: teacher cheating is rarely looked for, hardly ever detected, and just about never punished. How might a teacher go about cheating? There are any number of possibilities, from brazen to subtle. A FTH grade student in Oakland recently came home from school and gaily told her mother that her super nice teacher had written the answers to the state exam right there on the chalkboard. Such instances are certainly rare, for placing your fate in the hands of 30 prepubescent witnesses doesn't seem like a risk that even the worst teacher would take. The Oakland teacher was duly read. There are more nuanced ways to innate students' scores. A teacher can simply give students extra time to complete the test. If she obtains a copy of the exam early, that is, illegitimately, she can prepare them for Spec-C questions. More broadly, she can teach to the test, basing her lesson plans on questions from past year's exams, which isn't considered cheating but may well violate the spirit of the test. Since these tests all have multiple-choice answers, with no penalty for wrong guesses, a teacher might instruct her students to randomly LL in every blank as the clock is winding down, perhaps inserting a long string of B's or an alternating pattern of B's and C's. She might even LL in the blanks for them after they've left the room. But if a teacher really wanted to cheat, and make it worth her while, she might collect her students' answer sheets and, in the hour or so before turning them in to be read by an electronic scanner, erase the wrong answers and LL incorrect ones. And you always thought that no. 2 pencil was for the children to change their answers. If this kind of teacher cheating is truly going on, how might it be detected? To catch a cheater, it helps to think like one. If you were willing to erase your students' wrong answers and LL incorrect ones, you probably wouldn't want to change too many wrong answers. That would clearly be a tip-off. You probably wouldn't even want to change answers on every student's test, another tip-off. Nor, in all likelihood, would you have enough time, because the answer sheets have to be turned in soon after the test is over. So what you might do is select a string of 8 or 10 consecutive questions and LL in the correct answers for, say, 1/2 or 2/3 of your students. You could easily memorize a short pattern of correct answers, and it would be a lot faster to erase and change that pattern than to go through each student's answer sheet individually. You might even think to focus your activity toward the end of the test, where the questions tend to be harder than the earlier questions. In that way, you'd be most likely to substitute correct answers for wrong ones.